Hello everyone, and welcome back to the PTC Industry Talks. As always, my name is Daniel, and I'll be your host for this evening's discussion. For those of you new to Industry Talks, should you wish to pose a question to the guest speaker, feel free to. Please post it to the chat box to the right of the window, and we'll bring it up during the question and answer session towards the end of our discussion. However, it's topical. We'll try and incorporate it in our discussion with this evening's guest speaker. Our guest speaker for today is Captain Bruce Hyde. Bruce began flying in 1991 and has worked for a variety of well-known South African operators and organizations during the span of his 30-year career. He is currently the head of training with South African operator Mango Airlines, where he has been involved for the past 13 years. He's a flight instructor at Grade 1 DFE 1, and he's here to discuss how to hack the airline interview. Bruce, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good evening, Daniel. How are you doing?
Hi there, Bruce. Well, welcome on the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me. And I look forward to spending the next 30 to 40 minutes in your company and everybody else's.
Fantastic. And we really do appreciate the time making yourself available for tonight's discussion. Now, Bruce, you've had a variety of interviews during your career, specifically being the interviewee as well as the interviewer. Now, we're here to discuss the airline interview process, one of the most nerve-wracking days of any pilot's career. Based on your experience of the interview process, does it vary significantly depending on the kind of operator, or is it relatively or fundamentally the same kind of process each time?
Daniel, thanks very much, and thanks for the introduction. Firstly, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Every airline operator will have a different selection process. Some of these range from a multi-day event, I'm talking 3, 4, 5 days selection process, where you'll have group interviews. You'll probably be subject to a medical examination, a psychometric data set, a simulator evaluation. Typical on aircraft you've never flown before, just to add this, make it even more stressful. Other operators may have something no more than a 30-minute one-on-one interview. And then on the other extreme, you may get a phone call saying, congratulations, can you start on Monday morning? And you don't even remember applying for the job. So it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. However,
Okay, so...
Sorry, Daniel. It's safe to say, in terms of the selection process for any operator, there will be at least 3 phases. An interview of some form or the other, normally a simulator assessment, also some form or the other, and normally either a medical or psychometric or both. So it's safe to say those will be at least the 3 stages most operators would look at.
Okay, well, let's start with how one goes about seeking a vacancy for an operator. So how does a pilot looking for employment or source of potential opportunity within the industry know where to look? What kind of channels would an operator usually advertise through?
Well, in the old days, for those of you that remember things such as print newspapers and print magazines, operators would often advertise in a newspaper, otherwise in aviation magazines. Magazines which come to mind locally, World Air News used to have a little employment column in the back, and Flight International's fairly well known internationally for pilot recruitment ads in the back of the Flight Internationals. But as the world's progressed and we've moved away from print media, a lot of airlines have gone to using actual online recruitment agencies, and a good example of this would be CAE Park Aviation, where you would register as a pilot looking for a job, and they would supply pilots to airlines. Other operators, locally, Airlink is a very good example of this. Their own online web platform has a employment portal, and you'd fill in the relevant questionnaires and answer the questions and take it from there. And then probably one of the most common ways is literally just word of mouth. A friend of a friend said, ABC Airlines is looking for pilots, and please give us your CV.
Okay, so applying for a vacancy now, you mentioned there's a lot of different channels one can apply through, whether it be an online or just handing in a paper CV. Now, a lot of people or a lot of operators will list experience requirements when applying for a position. How does an operator determine what those requirements are when seeking potential hires?
You talking about minimum experience in terms of flying hours? Is that your question, Daniel?
Yes.
Sure. Every operator, once again, will have their own internal requirements. It's normally one looks at your flying experience. It could be minimum flight hours. It could be a minimum standard of license. Let's say an ATPL is the minimum standard. Other operators may actually request that you are type rated on a specific aircraft. And then we need to not only look at the pilot's professional qualifications, the Human Resources Department of Airlines may also state a minimum. For example, citizenship, or a minimum and maximum age, possibly a language proficiency rating of a specific level. So it's a twofold. Not only the pilot's experience on one side, then also the operator's own internal policies have to be satisfied.
Okay. Now, when handing in just a standard CV, there are a lot of opinions regarding the length, layout, and format of a CV. What advice do you have regarding the preparation and structure of a CV in order to make it more appealing to an operator?
Sure. I guess books have been written on this. First and foremost, comply with the exact requirements of that advertised position. So if they're asking for a one-page CV, send a one-page CV. The reason why I say that, if you don't comply with the exact requirements, what does it actually say about the person's professional ability? The operator said, we want A, B, and C from you, and the pilot goes and provides A to Z. It's superfluous information which actually they don't want at that time. As for your CV, it must be an absolute accurate reflection of who you are. Your CV must speak to your professional experience. Remember, through the interview process, your logbook will be reviewed. And if there's a difference in flying hours between your CV and your logbook, it may raise some questions right at that stage. Is a picture a good idea? Yes, I would say a head and shoulders picture, so the operator can put a face to the name, literally. Professional picture. That doesn't mean done by a professional photographer. Most smartphones can snap a more than adequate picture. But a professional image which projects you as a professional pilot. In a uniform is fine, in maybe a formal suit, in the cockpit, anything along those lines is absolutely adequate. Things which I've seen, references on your CV. Often operators will ask for references. These references must be valid and contactable. Far too often we've seen applicants with references on CVs where the telephone numbers are wrong. Or better still, you phone the reference and they say, I actually don't know the person you're talking about. I may have met him at the pub night at the local flying club. So make sure that that reference is going to stand by you should they be phoned by the operator. It goes without saying, your CV, as I said, must be an accurate reflection of yourself. Don't artificially inflate your flying hours on a CV. If you're going to put flying hours there, rather round them down a bit than round them up. It doesn't look very good when you pick up discrepancies between the logbook and the pilot CV. We're talking about CV length. One page is normally more than adequate. If the operator wants more, they can ask for more.
All right, so let's talk references. Bruce, you touched on specifically make sure your references are contactable. Now, when deciding what references to put onto your CV, what guidance do you have in terms of, should you go for personal references, friends, family? Are you looking at purely professional references, a combination of both? What would you advise probably be the best way forward?
I would recommend a combination of both, with probably more sway towards professional references. Professional references could be a flight instructor. It could be as far as your chief pilot at your current operation. Pilots, you may say to your chief pilot, I'm looking at other employment opportunities. May I use you as a reference? Always get someone's permission before you use it. So professional reference would be people who can speak of you in your flying environment. What do you like? How good are you? What's your technical knowledge like? What do you like as a pilot? Personal references may or may not be requested. It could be anything from a very good friend to a family member to someone outside aviation you've engaged with. So let's say you maybe came from a corporate background, and maybe your former managing director of your former where you used to work. So those will be sort of personal references if required.
Now, often people say when applying for vacancies, you need to put as many lines out in the water as possible to increase your chances of success. Good advice. However, sometimes you come up against those experience requirements. I may not necessarily hold the required rating. I might not necessarily have a specific element of the experience requirements which the operator is seeking. Is it still worthwhile applying for that position? Or is it best looking for positions or vacancies which detail your specific experience requirements?
Dan, it's a great question, and it almost circles back to the original statement I made. Comply with the exact requirements of the position advertised. So if there are minimum standards set, I would not recommend unless you're applying to that operator. First of all, they're not going to look at you at all because you don't meet their minimum requirements. But you may also hit a sore point with the operator. You've got to see it from our side. We don't just get one CV. You could get 100 CVs a day or 100 CVs a week. And to flesh out all the ones which actually don't meet the minimum requirements can become a bit frustrating. So I would say to anybody, if you meet the minimum requirements, by all means, put a CV in. Put a CV in on a regular basis. But if you don't meet the requirements, it may be best not to go and bug operators continuously when you don't meet their requirements.
All right. So I apply for a vacancy, I get contacted by email or phone call, whatever it may be. Please attend interview, panel interview for XYZ airlines. We know, and I'm sure you know from personal experience, an airline interview itself is an incredibly stressful event in any pilot's life. It's probably one of the most stressful events next to your initial commercial pilot's test that you have to undergo. And, it's all focusing on not only what you know, but how one conducts themselves within an interview to give themselves the best chance of success. Now, looking at etiquette, how is a candidate expected to conduct themselves when engaging with the interview board? What is considered good etiquette in terms of how you engage with the panel and how one should dress or present themselves for this interview process?
Daniel, you mentioned the very valid point that an airline interview is a nerve-wracking experience for anybody going through it. The more interviews you do, obviously, the better it becomes. So any pilot, in order to reduce stress levels, you need to be prepared, as best prepared as possible. So it goes without saying, be prepared. Know who your prospective employee is, and pre-interview preparation is vital. Books have been written on it. I'm sure most airlines have little cheat sheets where all the regular questions are asked and people memorize these questions. So how to conduct yourself? Interview etiquette, if I may use those words. Dress appropriately. And maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but a formal jacket and tie, I'm not talking about a bow tie, but a jacket and tie would be appropriate. If you don't have one of those, safe bet is always your pilot's uniform. That's always a safe bet to go to an interview because it represents who you are. Having said that, if you're coming from a bush pilot background and you wear shorts and a white shirt with epaulets, maybe that's not quite applicable for an airline interview. So dress up. Arrive early for your interview. It helps calm yourself down, and if you get lost on the way, you can't find parking, at least you don't start stressing that you're going to be late. So arrive early. And please, and we've seen this in interviews, bring all the requested documents with. An operator would normally, by a telephone call or email, say, can you please bring a copy of your license and your ID and a copy of your CV, and they may ask for a host of other stuff. And past experience has told me pilots have arrived at the interview without the requested documents. You arrive at an airline and you don't even have your logbook with you, and there's always some excuse for it. But it doesn't bode well for the selection board when you can't even come prepared with the requested documents. I'd just like to draw a little parallel for the guys and ladies listening. When airlines interview, they are effectively looking at a middle to senior manager. That is what a pilot is to them if you compare it to the corporate world. You are a pilot in terms of what you're employed to do and your responsibilities and accountabilities. You're looking at middle to senior manager. So we would expect to see that level of maturity in the way you present yourself, the way you come prepared. Dan, back to you.
Okay. How to phrase this? I'm sure that even the best prepared candidate might not always necessarily have all the answers. So I actually have two questions for you regarding the specific elements. At what level do you expect a candidate to demonstrate their technical knowledge? And how should they respond to a question if they just don't know the answer?
Great question, Daniel. Your technical knowledge should speak to your level of experience. So if you advertise yourself as a 5,000 hour total time pilot with 2,500 hours multi-engine turbine instruction, and you advertise yourself as a current instrument instructor, as in you're teaching instrument ratings on a day-to-day basis, if you ask questions on turboprops and multi-engine and instrument flying, you would expect the person to answer that because this is what they claim their experience is. So make sure that you can answer technical questions which is level with your experience. If you don't know an answer, and obviously it happens, simply say, I'm not sure of it, or I know where to look for it, I'll go find it. It's not a failure not to know an answer. I mean, it's impossible to know everything. So not knowing an answer does not disqualify you at all. It actually shows you who you are. And if you can box your way out of the corner saying, well, guys, I've got no idea what you're talking about, or I can get the answer, but I'll have to go look in this book first. At least it shows who you are. It shows you can box you out the corner. You can probably do a bit of problem solving as well.
Would it be appropriate to say, look, I'm not too sure what the answer is, but I have an idea. Could I perhaps take a shot at it?
Yes, by all means. And normally if you give the wrong answer, you'll generate a bit of a chuckle from the selection board and you'll probably be told what the right answer is. But it does show who you are, as long as you don't continue down this path of trying to guess all the answers. That comes across very quickly if the person is doing that. Okay.
Now, you have interviewed a wealth of pilots with various levels of experience during the interview or during the interviews that you've conducted. Now, often one hears, I went for the interview process. There were guys with X amount of time on these types of aircraft. I haven't even had exposure to those kinds of platforms before. How much of an advantage does just looking at purely total time offer a candidate when presenting for a panel interview? And how does the type of experience impact, say, someone when applying for an interview or undergoing an interview, shall I rather say?
I think, Daniel, the path you're going down is how valuable is my total time? So if I'm at an interview with 15,000 hours and the next guy next to me has only got 2,000 hours, I need to get the job because I've got the greater experience. So many, many years ago, total time was the holy grail. It was incorrectly assumed that the pilot with the highest hours had the best experience, was the most qualified for the job. This thought process actually, it's a fallacy. It's not correct. So flying hours gives an indication to the person's overall flying experience. But there's a lot of other stuff in the multi-crew environment, which airlines are typically looking at, which goes into building the pilot's total experience, if I can use those terms. So although you may not have the highest flying hours of everybody interviewed on a specific day, If you've got other qualifications, you may have a CRM qualification. You may have your safety emergency procedures training. You may have experience in a multi-crew environment already. You may even have jet experience already. These are all regarded as positives. So what the selection board or airline would do, they would look at the pilot's overall experience, not just flying hour related. They look at all the person's other qualifications, and maybe even a tertiary degree would come into it, a BCom or a Bachelor of Science. And this all adds to the pilot's job maturity, as we call it. And so it's a blended approach. It's no longer the man with the highest flying hours is the most suitable person for the job. You must remember, Daniel, in your modern airline operations, it's all multi-crew operations, obviously two pilots in the flight deck. And we need airline crew members to work together and rely on their collective experiences to ensure efficient and safe operations. So all of these other qualifications, as discussed, will add to your total experience, and it's not just flying hours. And the operator will make a decision based on that at the end of the day.
Oh, that's quite an interesting point, because you mentioned it's not just total flying experience. If you have a CRM qualification or additional qualifications to add to your CV, particularly you mentioned a BCom or a BSc, how does an airline grade their prospective hires? Is there a specific grading scale in which points are allocated, or is it purely subjective, or a combination of both?
Daniel, that would be very much up to the operator. And as you said, some airlines have a grading matrix where the person with the highest score will be offered the job first. An example of this would be you have an ATP, we give you a score of 1. You've only got a COM, you get a score of 0. You have 1,000 hours in a multi-crew environment, we give you a score of 10. You've got less than 1,000 hours, we give you a score of 8. So some airlines may give a numeric value to specific experience levels they are after, and they add the scores up at the end of the day, and they say, right, those are the highest scores, you get the job. Other airlines may be completely subjective. They don't look at any scoring process. It's purely a decision made by meeting the person. I think other airlines may have a bit of a blended approach, and I think that is the way most airlines do it. We'll probably talk about maybe a bit later on the psychometric results. Those are normally expressed in numeric values, so it could be a blended approach looking at other phases through the interview process.
All right, so one of the other key documents that pilots are expected to bring to an interview, other than a valid license, sometimes a copy of one's CV, you mentioned the logbook. Now, when a pilot's logbook is scrutinized during the interview process, as I imagine one does, what are you looking for specifically in terms of presentation of the logbook? What's deemed to be appropriate, and what are the common red flags or mistakes you find people making within their logbooks?
So let's talk about presenting the presentable logbook. First and foremost, I've seen a lot of logbooks in my life. Some are written, which is 100% fine. Some are electronic. Some guys they started off handwritten, they became electronic. That's a bit like me personally. I've got terrible handwriting and I got tired of writing, so I went electronic. It doesn't matter whether you're written, electronic, or combination. First and foremost, we must understand that a logbook is a legal document. It's very clearly stated in the South African regulations and technical standards that every pilot, regardless of the license they hold, must have a logbook. The law goes as far as saying how often you must put entries into it. It tells you exactly how the logbook must be formatted. So you can't just go and you can do an Excel logbook, but make sure that the columns are as required by the cats and the cars. So with that in mind, it's a legal document. So since it's a legal document, please ensure that you always keep the following in mind in doing your logbook. First of all, simulated time should not be added to your flight time. So you don't put your total flying time down as simulated time plus your total flight time. That's actually clearly documented on our CAA's website. So you keep the totals separate, but you don't combine them at the end of the day. Errors which I've seen in logbooks, if you look on the bottom left-hand corner of the South African logbook, there's a little note that says either grand total flying time or total flying time. So when you start a successive page, carry over the new grand total flight time. Far too often we review a candidate's logbook and they haven't bothered to put the total flight time there. So the only way to get it is to add up all 15 or 16 columns mentally in your head. It's a legal document. It has to be there. It's not a case of, oh, I forgot about it. It needs to be done correctly. In most, it's certainly in the ATP case, South Africa, the CAA requires a 12-month summary. So every 12 months or more frequently, there should be a neat 12-month summary of your flying experience. Neatness, this is if you're doing a handwritten logbook, neatness of your handwriting and spelling should be correct. And on that note, feel free to personalize the logbook. We see a lot of logbooks where guys have had a special moment. Maybe there's a picture of their first solo or their first jet aircraft, or their father flew and they had a flight with their father, and they take these pictures or make a little handwritten note. That's absolutely fine. Some guys go as far as having their logbooks bind in this wonderful leather binder and a personalized name on the outside. That's great. At the end of the day, a logbook's a bit like a personal diary. The last thing I'd like to say about logbooks is accurate logbook completion. Remember, the logbook is the most easily acceptable record of a pilot's flying hours. And it's also the easiest one to fraud. We've come across more than once interview processes, what we call Parker pen hours, where a pilot has artificially inflated their total flying hours. On the very odd occasion, it's an absolute error, but most often than not, it's actually been a fairly deliberate attempt to appear more experienced than they are. A great example, I don't mind sharing this with the group, hard to believe, but I've seen with my own two eyes. A particular pilot had a flight from A to B. I won't give you the departure or destination because that could be giving the game away. But let's say the flight was less than 20 nautical miles and was done in a barren type of aircraft with a flight time of 8 hours, 20 minutes. Now, you could accept a typo, but 8 hours and 20 minutes on a 20 nautical mile flight was a bit extreme. So please don't artificially inflate your logbooks. It will bite you. And because it's a legal document, it is reviewed in a very serious light by the CAA. And you could actually find yourself being investigated by a CAA, or if you're overseas, by other aviation authority. Just on that note of logbooks, I know some international carriers, when you apply for a position there, they ask for an auditor logbook. They actually want an auditor to go through your logbook and confirm what is in there is accurate.
All right, and you mentioned typo, Bruce. We all make mistakes, particularly in our logbooks. No one's perfect, I'm sure. What would be the most appropriate way to correct that mistake in order to ensure that logbook remains presentable for an interview panel?
Avoid typics. Simply put a line through the entry, put a new line in underneath, and you could say entered in error or error corrected. It's upfront. You're not trying to hide anything. You will make mistakes. Obviously, if it's an electronic logbook, you can normally just delete the entry and put it back in the game.
Okay. Now, are there any other surprises that one may find during an interview panel? For example, are there any other processes? Are there background checks that are conducted before the interview? Does it occur during or after the interview? What other elements should we be looking out for?
So let's go back a step, Daniel, if I may. When a pilot presents themselves with a selection board, there'll normally be 4 or 5 people on that selection board, ranging from senior pilots, normally an instructor, and maybe possibly a chief pilot. You'd normally have a representative of the company's human resources department on that selection board, and I'll expand on that shortly. And in some cases, you may even have a pilot union member sitting on the selection board. The function of the union member is not to ask questions, but simply to ensure that fairness is, that there's a consistency and fairness through all the successive interviews. We can't interview Daniel this way and another person another way. We've got to have a baseline standard. So we're comparing everybody to the same set of rules. So let's just look at why is there a human resources department rep on the selection board? More than often not, they're not pilots. They know very little about regulations and technical things and Jefferson and all-weather ops. In fact, they may be completely clueless to it. But remember, a selection board does not operate in isolation to the rest of the airline. Yes, we are interviewing a pilot. Remember, I talked about, in comparison, your middle to senior level management. And the human resources department may have their own requirements which must be met. So it's not just a technical interview. There's the questions from the human resources side, or at least clarification and confirmation. Typically, the human resources would want to see copies of matric certificates, copies of IDs. They may have their own set of questions and their own requirements. So we touched on citizenship. I certainly know the operator I work for will only take citizens of this country. That's an operator-specific thing. Human resources may want to do a security check on you. In fact, in most cases, they will. So if there's something we need to know about, rather talk about it at your interview than we discover it afterwards. So be upfront and be completely honest. Remember, I said honesty does not disqualify you.
You also mentioned that there's a wealth of people on the board, not specifically pilots as well. For example, HR. How does one address the panel? Do you address them by the first names if you know them, or is it purely formal, captain, ma'am? What would be the best way to go about just addressing the panel?
So it's obviously a formal interview. And in most cases, you would not have met anybody on the selection board panel. You may have heard about them. You may have seen them in passing. On an odd occasion, a selection board member may be a friend, but in most cases, you will not necessarily know the people on the selection board. So be absolutely safe. Captain, if that is the way it is, and if there's a lady on the selection board, ma'am or Mrs. whoever, be led by the selection board. If the selection board says, no, we're not that formal, my name's Bruce, my name's Daniel, then obviously first name basis apply, but they've invited it, they've allowed you to do it. So keep it clean, rather be more conservative than the other way around until the selection board says otherwise.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier on in our discussion, and I want to bring it up now, your knowledge needs to speak to your experience. And you mentioned oftentimes you're applying for a position on for an operator for a type, which you may not necessarily be type rated on. Now, pertaining to technical knowledge, will you be expected to know anything about the aircraft for which you will be interviewing, or for the position which you're interviewing for, and to what extent does that knowledge need to extend?
Daniel, it goes without saying, if a pilot advertises themselves as type rate on that operator-specific type, without doubt, there will be questions asked about the aircraft. But from the operator point of view, we've got to take into account, when last did the person fly this aircraft? Do they have actual experience on the aircraft, or they've just got the type rating and they've got no flying experience? So we've got to look at a blended approach. If the person just has the type rating with no experience in type, and the type rating was recently obtained, you could probably expect some technical questions on the aircraft, but not much more. But if the type rating was obtained many years ago and was never actually used, let's say someone gets an Airbus type rating, but they never actually fly an Airbus, it would be unfair of the operator to ask technical questions. See, that knowledge may not be fresh in the person's mind. So we're very much aware of how much experience the person has on the aircraft. We're not going to go and hijack someone just because they are type rated. It would be unfair of us.
All right. But this also extends to the simulated check riders as well. Often a candidate might not be type rated on, in fact, as you mentioned, more often than not, they aren't type rated on that specific platform. Now, if you're assessing a mix of candidates, ones which may be type rated, actively flying the aircraft, and those that are not, what are you assessing in terms of their performance given this fact? And how should a pilot conduct themselves to give themselves the best chance of success should they not be type rated?
Daniel, why don't we expand all about the simulator check ride, the simulator profile? So one assumes that you've been successful at an interview and now you pass on to the next phase, which would normally be a simulator check ride. Simulators running at 4,500 Rand an hour in South Africa for a level D simulator. So the operator's not just going to put you there if you haven't passed the interview. So once again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Every operator will have a different flight profile they wish the candidate to follow or to fly. And in most cases, it could be something from let's rephrase it, could be a really simple profile to a really complicated flight profile, which they expect the candidate to fly. As I said, in most cases, you may not be type rated, so you're really thrown in the deep end over there and you expect it to swim. So if you are not type rated, we're not looking at technical knowledge on the aircraft. I mean, we can't expect that. However, if you claim to be from a multi-crew operation, which you would have discovered already in the interview, we would expect to see elements of a multi-crew operation in place. So to give you an example, Daniel, if I say to you, positive rate of climb, what are you going to say to me?
Gear up.
And if I said to you a glide slope green, what would your response be?
Certain approach altitude.
So there we already bringing in elements of the multi-crew operation. There's common elements to multi-crew operation. So we would expect to see that in place. We would expect to see basic flying skills in place. So can the person fly a flight director? Do they recognize a deviation from altitude or airspeed or heading, whatever the case may be? And do they make an attempt to get back to where they're from? So that is what we would expect to see from a non-type rated candidate. From a candidate who is type rated, we would without doubt expect to see elements of the actual aircraft. So there are certain ways of flying an Airbus and certain ways of flying a Boeing. And if you are type rated, that should be embedded with your flying skills already. We would expect to see that. And if we don't see that, it would raise concern almost immediately and say, this person is type rated, they've got some time on the aircraft, but they're not flying it like you would fly the actual aircraft. Is it the pilot or is it from the operator he's come from?
Okay. Now, what are absolute red lines? Now, one often hears that you can't necessarily fail a sim check ride, or sometimes you may not necessarily have failed it. You may just have not have been the most successful of the candidates that have applied for the position. Are there any absolute red flags or lines that mistakes that one can make which will absolutely disqualify them for the rest of the process as part of the simulator check ride?
So the sim check ride, it once again depends on the operator. Some operators, I know some of the Asian operators do this, you will probably get a flight profile in advance. And it will say in this flight profile to the very knot, altitude and heading which you must fly. And they expect you to fly to the last knot of airspeed, the last foot of altitude, and the last degree of heading. Obviously, they expect to that level of accuracy. So if you're not going to achieve that, you'll be out of the game before you even started. So if you get the flight profile in advance, the operator will expect that you study it and you go fly it. So that's a desktop simulator could be very advantageous to you. However, other operators will give you the flight profile on the day and a quick briefing, and next thing you hit the simulator. No preparation, barring a 30-minute briefing. So now you've got to go and fly this profile with no preparation, no practice. So what would be a red flag to fail? If you start deviating from a heading and altitude or an airspeed, and the deviation got larger and larger, and there was no correction to go back to it, that would be a cause of concern. Think about the standards, think about the requirements of your revalidation every year. If you keep within those tolerances, you recognize the deviation, you make an attempt to get back to it, you correct it, that's great. Also, what happens in the simulator profiles, at least in our case, we are allowed to give corrective patter. If a pilot responds positively to corrective patter, as in you're doing this wrong, let's try again. If he responds positively, that is cause for a pass. But if corrective patter is given once, maybe twice, and the pilot cannot correct it or not show any signs of correcting, that will cause a bit of a red flag for us, because it says, is the person trainable down the line?
So what would be the advantage then of not giving a candidate the profile beforehand and just expecting him to fly? Why would an operator take that approach for the simulator check ride?
Sorry, Dan, just rephrase your question.
So during the simulator check ride process, you said there's two options. You'd either be given the profile beforehand, you expect it to go practice, or you'd just be given it on the day. Why would an operator opt to spring the simulator profile on a specific candidate on the day and not give them prior notice?
So once again, giving the candidate the profile in advance, you can go and study it and you rote learn it. it shows very little ability of the pilot's actual flying ability, because they went and studied it, they went to the simulator, they've actually learned it parrot fashion. Personal opinion doesn't show much about the pilot and how trainable they are. Giving them the profile on the day, the simulator assessment takes on what you could call a dynamic assessment, as in how quickly does the pilot learn and are they trainable through corrective pattern. It shows the pilot in a more natural environment. We need to admit that flying every day when you go for a flight, that flight is not scripted. Anything could happen on that day, and you need to be resilient and rebound. So it's a personal opinion, I admit it, but the profile on the day gives the operator a far greater view and understanding of the pilot of how trainable they are, how they respond to stress. It's a far better assessment methodology, in my personal opinion.
Okay, so it all comes down to just being trainable. Is this person ultimately going to be successful?
Absolutely. Do they have some basic flying skills and multi-crew skills in place already?
Now, there may be, you touched on it earlier, there are other kind of tools which are used to assess whether a person will be suitable or if they're trainable, how they handle stress. And that comes down to the psychometric assessment, something that no pilot can prepare for. And there's a lot of opinions on how you need to approach a psychometric profile. And of course, it's quite a degree of anxiety amongst pilots, considering you're not too sure what an operator is looking for. And are you what they're looking for, which is why I suppose their process is there. How does an operator use the psychometric results to guide their decisions when considering a potential hire?
It's a great question, Daniel. Let's break it down first. Let's separate medical and psychometrics. Let's move them apart. A medical, if an operator does it, a medical you can fail. High blood pressure, for example. You may discover that you've got high blood pressure. And I use that simply as an example. So a medical you can fail. And for the people listening, I want to stress out there, a psychometric you cannot fail. You cannot fail a psychometric. So if you are unsuccessful at a psychometric, don't go hang up your wings. It's not the be all and end all. And it's quite possible you would fare far better on another psychometric database or question set. So once again, every operator, if they use psychometrics as a tool of their selection board, will have their own psychometric question set which they apply. Some psychometric sets, and I believe PTC uses Compass, are very much aviation specific. They're directed at pilots. There are only 4 pilots. Other operators may use a generic psychometric. And I go back to what I was saying earlier. When you employ a pilot, you're looking at middle to senior level manager. That's the equivalent in an office staff. So other operators may have a generic psychometric that they apply across the board. The nerve-wracking thing about psychometrics is you cannot study for them. You've got no idea what's coming your way. Regardless, the results of the psychometric are absolutely privileged. They're only shared with people who need to know what the results are, and that's typically 1 or 2 members of the selection board, and they can be shared with the candidate if requested. Outside that, they do not go any further. When it comes to operators, what they are trying to do is they're trying to put everybody in a box. I know it sounds terrible because we're all different personalities, we're all different heights, different eye colors, different weights. But in terms of personalities, they're trying to put people in a box. They don't want any extremes, highs or lows. If I can use a term, they all want you cut from the same piece of cloth. That's what they're after. And if you are unsuccessful at a psychometric, it may just mean for that operator, you don't fall inside their profile. It doesn't mean for another operator that you won't hack it. My own personal experience, which I've learned through many years of seeing psychometric results and seeing how this transfers to pilot training, there is definitely a direct link between psychometric results and training. I'm talking about high psychometric results, as in good results, normally translates into a very easily trainable pilot who does not struggle at all, at any aspect. Lower psychometric results, I don't mean fail, I just mean a lower psychometric result, often translates to a pilot who struggles a bit on the conversion course. Doesn't mean they don't pass, but more effort's got to go in. They've got to put in more effort. They don't take on the new skill set as easily as the person who has the higher result.
Guys, just for everybody watching out there, I've only got about 2 or 3 more questions there for Bruce. I'm going to start taking questions from everybody out there watching. So please feel free to use this time to draft a question that you'd like me to post to Bruce in the next 5 minutes or so. Bruce, so you mentioned you can fail a medical, you can't fail a psychometric. Why would an operator choose to put a pilot through a medical when, of course, to operate as a commercial pilot, you need to be the holder of a Class 1 medical certificate anyway?
So let's move outside the South African context. Medical requirements for operators outside South Africa may be very different to South Africa. So although you have a Class 1 South African medical, it may not cut it for a overseas airline. And an airline may have its own requirements. They may have a maximum, I hate to say this, they may have a maximum weight requirement. So although you pass your Class 1 medical, you're just a bit too big. that may be weight-wise or physically, you're just too big for the aeroplane. We don't all fly jets. Also, we don't all fly aircraft with large cockpits. So it really goes down there. An operator may have their own set of requirements. And outside the country, remember, we are not comparing apples with apples anymore. Another reason for failing a medical, and this I've seen with personal experience as well, is you may go through a medical and they pick up substance abuse. So although you've passed your medical on the odd weekend, you're doing things you shouldn't be doing, and that gets picked up through a medical examination.
Now, it's quite a rigorous process. You've made that abundantly clear. The CV application, conducting myself in front of an interview panel, the psychometrics, the medical, the simulated check ride. How do I know if I'm successful or not? And how is this communicated to the candidate?
Well, it's very important for an airline to remember that actually we are dealing with a human being. We're dealing with a person who's keen to get the job, and it is in our best interest, and it's professional to let the candidate know at every step of the way how they progressed. It goes without saying that you need to get through all the successive stages and pass them successfully. So once again, operator. It could go from a phone call to advise you of success or not success. It could be communicated to you electronically, typically by an email. I hate to admit it, there are some operators which just never get back to you. And it does happen in the modern day world. You often see an advert for a job and say, if we haven't communicated with you within 2 weeks, you can take it as your application was unsuccessful. So yeah, it's normally communicated verbally, electronically, or in other cases, the operator will not get back to you. Best to clarify at your interview. Most interviews, you'll have 5 minutes to ask your own questions. Ask the panel right there and then, how will you be notified of success or not success? Okay.
Well, Bruce, we've got quite a few questions from everybody watching, and I see they're still coming in. So we'll work through, we'll take a few and see if we can get to everyone. First question is from, I think, Dhruv. It says, a lot of people in the industry looking at the current scenario say jobs are scarce, but keep in touch with the aviation industry. What's something that one can do apart from going down the instructor rating road to keep your mind fresh and current and updated with the art of flying?
Sure. Good question, Dhruv. Keep your brain active. I know it may be absolutely mind-numbing to sit and do a bit of study, but I don't know what license you hold. You clearly would have studied for some license, I would like to think. So go back to the old books. Generate any interest, maybe in a different arena of aviation, maybe desktop simulation, maybe model aircraft flying. If you're not a member of a flying club, join a flying club and go talk flying around the flying club on a Saturday or Sunday. It doesn't mean you have to go and fly and rent in a small aircraft, but you are in that aviation circle. The moment you step outside the aviation circle and you isolate yourself, your knowledge goes very, very quickly. So remain connected by forums, by flying friends, by flying clubs, maybe developing an interest in another form of aviation, be it desktop simulation, model aircraft flying, and the such.
Bruce, another question is from Patrice. Hello, everyone. I'm from Mauritius. I don't know if this is the right platform, but when do you think things will get back to normal after this long pause related to the pandemic? It's an interesting question.
Patrice, I'd be a millionaire if I gave you the answer. The airline industry worldwide is devastated at the moment. However, having said that, there are certain pockets of aviation which are starting to pick up. South Africa is not really one of them at the moment. But the Americas and stuff, they are starting, the flying is generally starting to go back up. I wouldn't say to normal levels. How many years is it going to take? I think I've read about 5 different predictions in the last 5 months. So it really is it's a tough industry at the moment. Remember, if this is a positive, aviation follows a sine curve. It's got its peaks, it's got its troughs. We're sitting right at the bottom of a trough at the moment, and it will go back up. It's the time period which is undetermined at the moment. But if I were to hazard a guess, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years.
Bruce, would you say now's a good time to start training or to get involved in aviation?
Absolutely, Daniel. Now, that may sound like a strange question, but consider it takes you, a new pilot, anywhere between 2 and 5 years to become qualified, depending on your finances, obviously. But let's say at least a minimum of 2 years, and maybe a longer than that. The hope would be when you qualify, you are starting to pick up on that sine curve towards the peak again. And remember, 2 or 3 years down the line, pilots of my age are 3 or 4 years older, and we'll be almost out of aviation by then. So positions will open up.
Here's another question, Bruce, from Stefan. Just wants to know if multi-time is still a requirement to get a job within an operator. He said he heard 200 hours PRC is the minimum.
Terence, good evening to you. It'd be operator specific. Most operators would require a multi-engine time is what you're talking about, not multi-crew. The old adage of 200 hours PIC multi-time, it's not a regulated minima. Most operators use it as a sort of as a minima. I don't always support the idea, but if you've got multi-engine time, yes, it will benefit you, but appropriate multi-engine time. 200 hours on a Seneca 1 is not quite the same as 200 hours on a 737-800.
Yeah, so you mentioned it's an operator requirement, so it depends on their needs and even if they need it at all.
Absolutely.
Bruce, from Alex, it says, hi Bruce, could you please explain briefly to the audience what happens immediately after joining an airline, the induction process as well as line training?
Evening to you, Alex, in Port Alfred. Every operator, when you join an airline operator, the training is highly regulated and structured, and it's actually dictated by our South African regulations and technical standards. So immediately after joining the airline, you'll get a start date. In most cases, the airline will honor or should honor your current employee's notice period, which could vary from 24 hours to 3 months. You'll be given a start date. Your first day will involve a human resources induction, where you'll get things such as your crew card, you'll fill in reams of paperwork, who you are, what you are, your bank account details for your salary, your medical aid requirements. And if I can break it down, typical initial conversion training will take 3 months. Phase 1 takes a month. That's your soft courses, which includes the induction, CRM, ACPT, dangerous goods, firefighting. Phase 2 or month 2 would be simulator training. And phase 3, month 3, would be your initial operating experience on type flying the actual aircraft. So you're looking at a minimum of 90 days to get a new recruit up and running.
Now, Yannick's asked, can we get a little bit more insight into how to make a proper first impression? I suppose the first 30 seconds is what he's referring to.
Right. Before anybody opens their mouths, obviously the first thing we see of a person is how they look. So suit and tie, Yannick, with maybe I'm old-fashioned. I was told if you wear a suit, you wear it buttoned up, not over your arm. Hair neatly done, neat beard if you have a beard, otherwise clean shaven if you don't. Present yourself. It's protect a positive image, and take it from there.
Aisha asks, do you think airlines will eventually be hiring pilots that simply just have a CPL?
Aisha, at the moment, right now as we speak, I do not believe so, simply because there's so many airline pilots out there who are sitting jobless. Most of them would have the experience, the type ratings already. But at the top, as flying opportunities open up, there's no reason why airlines should not employ pilots. If you were to put your airline hat or your financial hat on from an airline point of view, pilots are cheap to hire on the salary, and they do exactly the same job as an airline transport pilot. So why shouldn't airlines hire pilots?
So that's a very, very interesting bit of insight there, Bruce. Robin,
they can do the first class as good as an ATP at half the cost.
Robin Gart asks, following on from Alex's question, could you expand on what sort of competencies are needed to succeed in the line induction phase, achieving a successful line check that perhaps not taught on the type rating, but are assumed knowledge? So I think what Robin's saying there is, type rating focuses on the technical aspects of operating the platform. What are assumed skill sets that one is expected to have with them once they begin the type rating training phase?
All right, Robin, I think I understand your question. Good evening to you. The simulator phase is highly scripted. The lesson plan is given up front, but assumed knowledge are things we would like to think most pilots have. Pilots joining an airline normally have an instrument rating. So we should not have to explain how the minima on an ILS works or how you read a Jefferson plate. So these are areas where there's an assumed knowledge that the pilot already has that skill set in place. Remember, an airline is not teaching an initial instrument rating. They are of the opinion the person has an instrument rating and has those skills in place already. So if I understand your question correctly, we're not going to go and teach you how to read a Jefferson plate on a conversion. The assumption is that it's in place already. And similarly to the regulations and technical standards, it is of the thought process that a pilot of that experience should have regulations, technical standards, knowledge already in place. We are there to teach you about the aircraft type. That's our expertise. And we will bolster other knowledge if we discover it is weak or lacking.
All right. Bruce, we'll take two more questions and then we'll wrap it up for the night. See one here. Good evening. Is having an engineering degree or any kind of degree considered an advantage in selecting candidates for an airline, or does it not matter at all?
We certainly look at someone who's got a tertiary education, an engineering degree, a Bachelor of Science, or even a BCom degree. It doesn't mean they're going to get the job, but we certainly view them as potential pilots. The reason for this is any further study shows a higher level of job maturity. That person's studied over and above their school and stuff. They've gone up to a university and they've got a degree. Whether they've used it or not is immaterial, but it shows a greater maturity. And the person's got the ability to study, they've got the knowledge to study. So yes, in most cases where we've interviewed people who have tertiary degrees, they often come along as quite a strong candidate. So yes, it would benefit you. And I think I stand to be corrected, but in America, I think having a degree is actually a mandatory requirement for airline flying there. But don't quote me on that.
I see there's a question from Keegan here. Bruce Hyde, what type of previous job experience looks appealing on a CV when applying to an airline? For example, there's bush flying, instructing, crop dusting, small charters, etc. What would be considered preferable prior experience?
Great things to do, all the things which Keegan's mentioned. We certainly take it into account. It adds to the person's job maturity. But a 10,000-hour bush pilot trying to get a job in an airline is not quite the person we want. So a blended experience. If you have a bit of small charter flying or Part 135 operations, that will go a long way to increasing your job maturity.
Guys, I think that is all we have time for this evening. Bruce, I just want to thank you once again for all that awesome insight and giving up so much of your time to take questions from everybody watching. We massively appreciate it, and I'm sure a lot of this will go a long way to helping relieve some of that anxiety when someone presents themselves to an interview panel.
Daniel, thanks very much for the invite. Thanks to PTC and everybody over there. If this hour-long chat has helped a few people on the way or made things clearer. I certainly value the time with you, and I hope that when the guys start interviewing again, whenever that may be, some of this interview goes to help making them successful candidates.
I'm sure it will. For those of you watching out there, please keep an eye on our YouTube channel for the next upload of this specific interview with Captain Bruce Hyde, Head of Training at Mango Airlines. Otherwise, please keep a close eye on our social media for our upcoming guest speakers, and the next industry talk is scheduled for the 19th of May. Otherwise, until then, everybody, keep safe, and we'll see you again soon.